So this is a review of something we talked about in Unit 8 at the end when we talked about solving by factoring. In order to solve by factoring, you have to know about the zero product property. When you are using the zero product property, what that says is if A times B equals 0, either A has to be 0 or B has to be 0 or both equal 0. So in our notes we had 3x equals 0. So 3 times what equals 0? 0. Or if this binomial times that binomial equals 0, either the first binomial equals 0 or the second binomial equals 0. If it's the first binomial, to solve for x, we get x equals -3. If it's the second binomial, we get x equals 1. So, for example, we could have a monomial times a binomial. We would say, okay, well, if this times that equals 0, either this, 7x, equals 0, or that, 10x minus 3, equals 0. We can solve for x. Divide by 7, doesn't matter, x still equals 0. Or add 3 to both sides, 10x equals 3, divide by 10, or x equals 3/10. We could write our answers like that, or we could write it as a solution set. So if one binomial times the other binomial equals 0, 3x plus 1 could equal 0, or 7x minus 5 equals 0. Okay. Minus 1 from both sides, on this case, x equals -1/3, or solving this two-step equation, x equals 5/7. Okay. Now we're going to use the zero product property to solve by factoring. So in this case, what if we just have a GCF? My GCF here is 2x. So 2x times 2x minus 1 equals 0. So using the zero product property, I know that 2x equals 0, or 2x minus 1 equals 0. If this equals 0, then x equals 0. But if this equals 0, I add 1 to both sides, divide by 2, x would equal 1/2. Over here, my coefficients they don't have a GCF, it would just be the y. So y times 3y plus 7. So either y equals 0 or 3y plus 7 equals 0. Minus 7 from both sides, divide by 3, y could equal -7/3. Now, when we have a trinomial, we would have to use the methods that we've learned to solve by factoring with our trinomial. Remember, the first thing we have to do is set it equal to 0. And if we have this trinomial, we ask ourselves, okay, what multiplies to be 8 but adds to be 6? 2 and 4. So because a equals 1, I don't have to group. We just know that 0 equals x plus 2 times x plus 4. So zero product property, either x plus 2 equals 0 or x plus 4 equals 0. And if that's the case, then x equals -2 or x equals -4. And you could write that as a solution set. On this one, the second example, what might be helpful is to factor out that -1, which isn't really factoring if we're setting it equal to 0. We could just divide everything by -1. And why we do that is because we did not have to group here because a equaled 1. We would have to do the grouping if a equals -1. So if you would make your life easier by factoring out that negative and then doing your x puzzle, what multiplies to be 2 but adds to be -3. -1 and -2. So that -1 doesn't really matter anymore because we know that something has to multiply to be 0. So either x minus 1 equals 0 or x minus 2 equals 0. So either x equals 1 or x equals 2. And we can write that as a solution set. So when you're doing this, do make sure that everything is always in standard form. Remember that standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. And remember what we're talking about here is review. We talked about this at the beginning of March, so you might already have these notes. A lot of these examples are the same. So subtract 2x from both sides. We get negative x squared minus 2x plus 15 equals 0. Divide everything by -1 so that I don't have to deal with the negative leading coefficient. What multiplies to be -15? That adds to be +2, a +5, and a -3. So x plus 5 times x minus 3 equals 0. X plus 5 equals 0, or x minus 3 equals 0. So x equals -5 or x equals 3. Now, on this example, if we add x squared to both sides, we have x squared minus 26x plus 169 equals 0. What you need to be aware of is we have something squared here and something squared here. So these are perfect squares. So ask yourself, what's the square root of x squared? Well, that's x. What's the square root of 169? That's 13. You were supposed to remember those things. And my middle term is negative. Now, how do I know that this is a perfect square trinomial? Because 2 times my first term in the binomial times my second term in the binomial gives me that middle term. So I know that this is a perfect square trinomial. So when I'm factoring it, I can make my life easier in that aspect. Otherwise, you can still ask yourself, what multiplies to be 169 but adds to be -26? In this case, if I were to take the square root of both sides, x minus 13 equals 0. So my solution is x equals 13. There's only one solution. Remember that a perfect square trinomial has a vertex on the x-axis. All right, the last part of our review is your trinomial when a does not equal 1. Remember that when you see something like this, you're going to have to group. Always ask yourself, make your life easier. Do you have any GCFs? No, because 17 is prime. So remember that you have to multiply to see what goes up here is a times c. So 6 times -14, -84. What multiplies to be -84 and adds to be 17. So remember how we can use our calculator to find factors. -6 and 14 would add to be 8. Okay, -4 and 21. Okay. Remember, this is how we break up our middle term. So 6x squared stays. Minus 4x plus 21x minus 14. These are the same. These would combine to be 17x, but now I can do what I need to do, and I can group. Coming out of this, my factor would be 2x, and we're left with 3x minus 2. Coming out of my second group is 7, And I'm left with 3x minus 2. Okay, so 2x plus 7 times 3x minus 2 equals 0. So zero product property says that 2x plus 7 equals 0, or 3x minus 2 equals 0. So x in this case would equal negative 7/2, or x in this case would equal, add 2, divide by 3, 2/3. Now, I might be going a little fast, but remember that's because we've already taken these notes. This is just a review. If we're looking over here, what do you notice about 121x squared? That is a perfect square. What do you notice about 169? That is a perfect square. So finding your square roots of those would help. And we know our middle term is negative, so we would have a minus here. Now, something to note, you need to check if that middle term is correct. So remember that middle term has to follow the pattern of 2 times the first term times the second term. So 2 times 11 times negative 13 gives me negative 286. So negative 286x. That is correct, meaning that this is a perfect square trinomial. So you could take the square root of both sides to get rid of that square right there. Add 13. Divide by 11. So x equals 13/11. What do we have to do first on this 8p squared minus 16p equals 10? The first thing you always have to do, get it set equal to 0. So minus 10 from both sides. 8p squared minus 16p minus 10 equals 0. What do you see first? A GCF. Remember, by factoring out a GCF, you're going to make your life easier with the numbers that you have. Because now, when I do my X puzzle, negative 5 times 4 is negative 20. And my middle term is negative 8. So now what multiplies me negative 20 adds to be negative 8. Well, I know my factors of 20 pretty well. This 2 is still out here. Remember that this tells me how to break up B. Now I have 4 terms, so I can group. This 2 still out there. My first group, 2p times 2p minus 5. Notice this says 2p minus 5. There's nothing that I can factor out of that besides a 1, so I factor out a 1. And this stays 2p minus 5. So I get 2 times 2p plus 1 times 2p minus 5 equals 0. So 2p plus 1 equals 0, 2p minus 5 equals 0. Remember, we don't have to worry about this coefficient of 2 because there's no variable in it. We're trying to solve for p. So p can equal negative 1/2 in this case, or 5/2 in this case. Last example to remind you about how to solve by factoring. These numbers are a little bit bigger, so keep in mind you might need to use your calculator. So remember, first step, got to get it set equal to 0. So 24x squared minus 22x plus 5 equals 0. 5 times 24, 120. What multiplies to be 120 adds to be negative 22. Okay, we want 2 negatives. These would be negative 26. Negative 10 and negative 12. Remember, that's how we break up our B term. So 24x squared minus 12x minus 10x plus 5 equals 0. Now we can group. my first group, factor out 12x. I leave 2x minus 1. Second group, okay, I need that to be a negative, so I'm going to factor out a negative 5, and I leave 2x minus 1. So 12x minus 5 times 2x minus 1 equals 0. 12x minus 5 equals 0, or 2x minus 1 equals 0. In this case, x would equal 5/12. In this case, x would equal 1/2. Okay, so those are our two solutions for this problem. All right, so that's your review on factoring using the zero product property for GCF and trinomials.